Hey there, this is Alvalin Lundgren, and this is Color for Digital Design. Our 7th session, we're talking about color schemes. So color schemes, or color harmonies, can be likened to harmony in music. Notes work together. Notes have certain relationships on the staves and work together to create the sounds. There are harmonious and discordant sounds within music. The same thing is true for color. We look at color chords, colors existing, hue families existing at regular intervals that make a harmonious sound. We can also work with discordant color for various reasons. As in music, the harmonious color understanding, the harmonious chords, is preferred and is applicable most of the time. So let's talk about what a color harmony or a color scheme is, and then how do we achieve it. So color schemes are meaningful relationships, they're balanced relationships, and those relationships are based on positioning of the 12 hue color wheel. So if we think of the hue circle almost as if it's a musical score, and we have the treble clef and the bass clef, and various notes are notated within each clef, and each note has its own position, its own voice, its own personality. And you can have a single note, or you can have multiple notes that are struck together to create a more fleshed out sound. The hue families have their positions. The various colors within the hue families do what they need to do. They're members of the families. They follow the parent of the hue family. And various hues create certain kinds of chords. We think of things that are harmonious as balanced. The other thing about color schemes is that they're meaningful. When you create a color scheme, it's not just an aesthetic understanding. That color scheme has to actually fit what you're trying to do. There's a lot of color pickers and color scheme makers online. And people publish books about color schemes and how to put together a tetrad or a triad and so forth. But a lot of those discussions miss the point of creating a color scheme that is going to solve a problem or fulfill a need or purpose. So you cannot just create a color scheme and expect it to work. It has to be relative and meaningful for the thing that you're designing. So let's begin by looking at what color scheme constructions are and what makes for harmonious color schemes. So just to quickly overview, there's a variety of options, obviously. We have related color schemes, and we have contrasting color schemes. And whether you pick a related or a contrasting color scheme, again, depends upon what you're trying to do. So the first related color scheme we'll talk about is monochromatic, and mono, of course, means one. Monochromatic color scheme is a single hue and a variety of colors within that hue family. So if we take red-violet, we can go anywhere from plum to a very light sort of lavender or lilac color. So various tint shades and tones of that hue will comprise the color scheme. Now, any color scheme we talk about can have accent colors from anywhere around the hue circle. So when we look at a color scheme, we want to look at the overall idea of the color. Because a majority of the time when you try to determine what color scheme a design or an image has, there will be certain colors that dominate. That's going to give you the overall scheme, but there will be other colors that don't fit within that scheme construct and act as accents. So this image shows a space that is decked out in various reds. So there's pink, there are warmer reds, there's some cooler reds. The overall sensibility is that it is a pink room. It has a variety of members of the red hue family. In an analogous scheme, there are no more than two primaries present, and one or both primaries need to be held in common by all the hue families involved. So starting with blue, moving into blue-violet, violet, and then red-violet, the two primaries, of course, are blue and red, and we have blue over here. If we also added red over here, red is not involved in blue and blue is not involved in red. And so that actually expands the color scheme to another harmonious scheme. Just with these four hues, we have no more than two primaries present, and blue is held in common among all four, and red is common to three of them. And you can go about a third around the hue circle in either direction and have a related color scheme if you start with a primary. An example of an analogous color scheme in this photograph. There's green, there's yellow green, there's no blues, there's no blue-greens. So just within the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary, we have the two primaries. We have yellow, and then we also have blue in some of the colors. The majority of color in the image is achromatic, it's gray. Black, white, and gray do not affect the chroma understanding in a chromatic color scheme. An accented neutral dominates on colors that are neutralized, not tinted, shaded, or toned, not fully saturated. So we're not mixing around the hue circle, we're stepping toward the center, toward that gray, but this is where the earth tones live, between two opposite hues. An accented neutral dominates on neutralized hues. It can have small amounts of accent colors, either within the hues that are creating the neutrals or other hues around the circle. Very often neutral color schemes are passive, and so you want to accent them with brighter color. So here's a book cover that's definitely a neutral color scheme. Achromatic means without chroma. So anything that's black and white, or black, white, and grays is achromatic. So there's no chroma, there's no hue, there's no saturation, we just have value. Achromatic color schemes can be very dramatic and very interesting visually. So moving on into the contrasting color harmonies, we'll start with complementary, which is the most simple, and we'll move into the most complex. Complementary color scheme, of course, is two hues that are direct opposites of each other on the hue circle. Within those two hues, we have the three primaries, in this case red and yellow and blue. Complementary color schemes are known as a dyad because they are only two hues. So any color within the green family, any color within the red family working together within a color scheme, perhaps with accent colors, colors drawn from other hue families or neutrals and black, white, or gray, but the overall scheme will dominate on the complementary understanding. So here in the Diebenkorn, we have a dominance of violet and yellow, a little bit of red-violet in here, and of course there's a lot of neutralization going on. But as we look at this, we think violet and yellow. So in spite of the fact that there's a few other hue families represented, most of what we see is violet and yellow, therefore it's a complementary color scheme. So remember, complementary is a dyad composed of two hues, and it uses direct opposites. So a split complementary is also a dyad, meaning it's only two hues. And it takes a hue and the nearest neighbor on one side or the other to the complement. So red's complement is green, and we saw that here. Next to green is blue-green on one side and yellow-green on the other. So both blue-green and yellow-green are split or near complements to red. But since a split complementary scheme is a dyad, we only take one of those two split complementaries. So in this case, we're showing red with the blue-green. Here's an example of a split complementary color scheme. We have red, a couple of variations of red, a cooler version and warmer versions with yellow-green. It makes a very lively design. Then we come to a triad. So you can see we're adding more hues into the construction. So in a triad, we have two options. It's our first kind of color scheme where we can have two options. And both involve triangles. And when I talk about a color scheme construct or construction, we're talking about the geometric construction of those figures, those geometric figures within the circle. So one of the triads is an equilateral triangle, and that means that you have three hues that are equally spaced around the hue circle. And in this case, we're showing the three primaries, this time using the technical primaries of cyan, magenta, and yellow. And they are spaced equidistant around the hue circle. Now I could take the secondaries, violet, orange, and green, or I could take tertiaries. So there are four possibilities for triads. One is the primary triad, one is the secondary, and you have two options for tertiary triads that are equidistant. The second option for a triad is to inscribe a isosceles triangle, which is the longer, skinnier one, into the hue circle. And you're taking a single hue with both of the splits. So remember here, we talked about taking one of the splits to make a split complementary, which is a dyad. In a triad, we take both of those split or near complements. So in this case, blue-green and yellow-green, along with the red, the magenta, create the triad. So again, three equally spaced hues, or a hue and both of its split complements. Example of an equidistant triad, red, yellow, blue, in this Vermeer painting. The next kind of harmonious color scheme is a tetrad. And in a tetrad, we've got four hues that are equally spaced as one option, which means we inscribe a square within the circle, or we take two complementary dyads that are not right next to each other. So we inscribe a rectangle within the hue circle. Green to yellow, orange to red to blue, violet is one tetrad where the hues are equally spaced, and then the green to the yellow to the red to the violet is the second tetrad using the rectangle. David Hockney, example of a tetrad. This top area and along the right side we have red and green. The pool is blue and orange. So blue and orange are complementary, red and green are complementary. And the last harmonious color construct we'll talk about is the hexad. And you have two options for the hexad. You have all the tertiaries together, or the primaries and secondaries all together. A hexad is 6 equidistant hues, or 6 equally spaced hues on the hue circle. Whenever you see a full color image that doesn't appear to have a less extensive color scheme, such as a tetrad or a complementary dyad, it will most likely be a hexad. And here's an example of a hexad. So this is a vintage poster from the 60s, and it is a tetrad. We have yellow and violet, and red here in the magenta, red, a little warmer red here, a couple of reds in the band's name, and green. So violet, yellow, red, and green are the dominant colors. There's a variety of yellows. We've got a cool yellow and a warm yellow. We've got a cool red and a warm red. We've got a warmer green and a cooler green. So variety of colors. Again, value, we go from dark to light, and it is a tetrad. Most of this photograph seems to be accented neutral. We've got some warm grays, we've got some light, very tan, very light grays, also fairly warm. There's some black, there's some white, there's some true neutral grays going on. We could say this is an accented neutral, but there's really too much chroma going on. The chroma actually becomes more of the focus. So what we have is the red-orange of the peppers, the red-violet of the onions, and then the greens. You have the hue, in this case green, and both of its splits, red-violet, red-orange. FedEx has a variety of divisions, and each division has its own color scheme. The parent color scheme is a partial triad with violet and orange. Its FedEx ground division is violet and yellow-green, and violet and yellow-green are a split complementary. This is a design exhibition poster. This dominates enough on the black, white, and gray to be considered an accented neutral. We were talking about this dominating on the neutrals and the grays. The chroma here is a little more forceful. Here, the chroma are accents. So this actually is an achromatic color scheme with blacks, whites, and grays with more saturated accents of color. Now, the accent colors pretty much represent a hexad. So you've got some red, there's some yellow-green, there's some green, there's some violet, yellow-orange, some yellows, some blues. So it's a hexadic understanding, but the main color scheme in this is black, white, and gray, making it achromatic with some accents. So this is an accented neutral. It's a shot of one of the cave paintings at Lascaux, France, and that is probably the oldest known evidence of graphic design that we know of. But the colors here are sort of a very dark ebony, almost black, and ochre. And then the color of the rock itself is fairly neutral. So this is a neutral color scheme. In this Art Nouveau piece, the colors dominate on orange in the figure and in the background, up in here. Red in the background. Green and blue-green. So the colors are a little too saturated to be an accented neutral. There's much more chroma than can be allowed in an accented neutral. So this is a tetrad. We have orange and blue, red and green. Those are 4 hues, creates a tetrad. So when you go to create a color scheme and figure out what colors to use, things you need to keep in mind are the purpose of the design. Who's the design for? What's the context? What's the problem that you are solving creatively? How are you going to pick colors to help fulfill that purpose or solve that problem? What is the personality of the design or illustration that you're creating? Is it happy? Is it a little more somber? Is it uplifting? Is it melancholy? You will select color to create an overall personality. Archetypes are ideal types or typologies of something. So this is a children's book. That's the archetype. It will be somewhat colorful. It will have contrasting color scheme. In this case, the cover has a title that seems to be laid out in what almost appears to be a hexad, but then we have yellow, orange, and blue-green, and of course black and white. And here we have a poster that dominates on red, represented by magenta, and a yellow-green, and the way the color is distributed through the design creates a lot of energy. But it's a very focused, ordered energy. There's a lot of horizontal, vertical grid going on. There's use of transparency. There's use of repetition to create pattern. There's all sorts of things going on. This is a very complex poster. This is completely different. This has a darker, more somber, more serious tone to it. It has a different purpose. This is talking about Bitcoin and the dark web and the development of Bitcoin as a disruptive and even subversive currency. And the archetype here is a bandit, a masked person who is hiding their identity. It is a monochromatic color scheme, red, black, and white. And again, there's too much red going on for it to be an accented neutral. And the presence of chroma takes it out of being a straight achromatic. So it's a monochromatic construct. Let's talk a little bit about color discord. Again, going back to music, you can create discordant chords where something is just not quite resolved. There is a sense in movement, a sense in music. When there is discord, you're waiting for resolution, or it's a transitional point within a movement from point A to point B. The same thing is true with color. When you work with color discord, it actually creates some tension. And if you're using color discord in your designs, you want that tension. You want that tension to create a certain kind of energy, to attract the eye in a certain way, to create a certain kind of personality. And you create that tension through the choice of scheme constructions. Actually, you don't really use a scheme construction that's harmonious. You don't use one at all. Saturation is also a factor because you're going to increase saturation of most of the colors, if not all, within the design. You may or may not decrease value contrast. The more you decrease the range of value differences within a design, the more other color contrasts will take over and become more apparent. And then extension, and that's the proportion, the amount of the colors. Some colors are more difficult to visually process. Yellow is the most difficult. Yellow-green is probably the next most difficult. They kind of glare at you. So this piece by Wes Wilson uses quite a bit of yellow-green against a very warm red moving into a red-orange. It starts red down here and moves into actually pretty much a straight-up orange. And it's that transition from the red to the orange is very subtle. This has a good amount of value contrast, but we could reduce the contrast, make the blue lighter, and there would be a lot more visual complementary or simultaneous vibration going on. And then the extent of the color. The colors that are most difficult to visually process are the colors that you will use more of in the design. So when do you want to use color discord? When you want to create a certain kind of energy, or a certain mood, or a certain kind of movement. So this is a very simple, almost compass rose design. It uses very non-traditional colors. A very warm cyan blue uses a very vivid red, very warm red. It uses a warm red-violet against a yellow-green. The hue families chosen do not fit within any harmonious color construct. And that doesn't make this a bad color scheme. It's highly effective. It catches the eye, and it communicates a certain type of energy. The colors in and of themselves have a bit of movement. The colored shapes tend to dance. The darker shapes tend to dance against the lighter background. This is predominantly achromatic, but it incorporates areas of orange and yellow-orange into a warm yellow, contrasted with a violet and a red-violet. And the chromatic colors are used transparently. So in the arrangement of color, we get a sense of movement and layering going on. There is a certain mood here, kind of an ominous sense to it simply by virtue of the color and how it's communicating. So in conclusion, you can have the right color constructs, but the wrong colors within those constructs, and the wrong constructs applied to the wrong things. You have to understand what your purpose is in choosing color. You have to make right selections, not just in that they're harmonious and they're pretty to look at, but they are useful in communicating what your design is trying to communicate. So they also need to be meaningful to the audience that is going to be utilizing or viewing the design, and also relevant. So the colors that you choose have a role of making the communication relevant to the people that you're targeting.